I've kept a ledger my whole life. Columns of numbers, debts, rainfall, inches, head of cattle, bad winters. Every man out here does some version of it, even if it's only scratching marks on a barn wall. You count what matters. You count what you're afraid of losing. The strangest thing I ever wrote in my ledger wasn't a drought year, wasn't the season half my herd went down with blackleg. It was a single line, dated the spring of 1887. Nora Voss arrived. Nothing will be the same. I didn't even know her yet. I wrote it because of the look on my neighbor Edmund Hale's face when the stage rolled in. That particular shade of satisfaction a man gets when he thinks he's solved a problem and doesn't realize he's just introduced one. He thought she'd manage the parlor, keep things tidy. Maybe bake. I watched that woman build the most stubborn, beautiful, ornery thing this valley ever saw, not in spite of him, but right through him, like a root through stone. And I wrote every bit of it down because somebody needed to, and because ledgers don't lie the way people do. The morning Nora Voss stepped off the Redstone stage, I was mending the south fence along Hale's property line, which put me close enough to see her face before Edmund did. She was not what he'd described to anyone who'd listen. Edmund had spent 3 months telling anyone who'd listen about his mail-order bride, educated woman, he said, refined, used to genteel living, comes from a good Ohio family. He'd said it the way a man describes a piece of furniture he's ordered from a catalog. Something to fill a room, something that would hold still. Nora Voss stepped down from that coach carrying a canvas satchel in one hand and a wooden seed crate in the other. The seed crate had holes drilled in the lid. I could see the dark crescent of soil under her fingernails from 40 feet away. Her dress was practical, not rough, but not the kind you'd worry about kneeling in. She looked at the town of Redstone the way a woman looks at a field she's already decided how to plant. Edmund tipped his hat and said something I couldn't hear. She tilted her head slightly, the way you do when someone says something that doesn't quite match what they put in their letters. Then she smiled, a real one, not a polite one, and held up the seed crate. Edmund looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he doesn't know how to categorize. I went back to the fence, but I wrote it in my ledger that night. My name is Elias Cord. I run 200 acres of mediocre ranch land east of Edmund Hale's property, mostly range cattle, a kitchen garden my late wife Agnes planted and I've kept alive out of stubbornness, and a habit of recording things in columns I developed during 3 years of Army supply logistics that I never quite shook. I write down rainfall, frost dates, cattle weight, the date the first crocus comes up in Agnes's garden. I write down things that don't fit in columns too, in the margins, in a slightly smaller hand, because I can't seem to stop, and because the margins are where the real story usually lives. Edmund Hale and I were not friends exactly. We were neighbors of the particular Western variety, the kind who help each other in emergencies and argue about fence lines in all other circumstances. He was 10 years older than me, had more land, and suffered from the particular blindness of a man who's been the most important person in every room he's ever entered. He wasn't cruel. He was simply convinced, down to his boot leather, that he understood how things were supposed to go. He had written to a matrimonial agency in Columbus, Ohio, in January of that year. I knew this because he told me with the casual confidence of a man placing a lumber order. He needed a wife. He'd had one, Margaret, who died of fever 4 winters back. He needed the house managed, he said. Needed someone sensible and capable. He had specified in his letter that he preferred a woman of mild temperament and no strong opinions about ranch operations. The agency had sent him Nora Voss, age 29, unmarried, former schoolteacher, daughter of an Ohio market gardener. I suspect they had read his specifications and made a decision about what he needed versus what he'd asked for. The first week was quiet enough. I saw Nora twice, once carrying water from the well with a focused efficiency that suggested she'd never considered it a hardship, and once standing at the edge of Edmund's south field with her arms crossed, looking at the soil in the specific way that people who understand soil look at it, not admiring it, assessing it. Edmund came to my place on the 8th day, ostensibly to discuss the spring fence repairs we'd agreed to split. But he poured himself coffee without being asked and sat down with the posture of a man carrying something he needed to put on a table. She's capable enough, he said. I waited. House is clean, she cooks not fancy but solid. He rotated the coffee cup in both hands. She's got opinions. About what? The South Quarter. He said it like it tasted bad. She wants to know why we're not running kitchen crops on it, says the soil reads good for root vegetables and leafy greens, says I'm losing money letting it sit in rough grass. I thought about the way she'd stood at the edge of that field. Is she wrong? Edmund didn't answer that. Men like Edmund rarely answer a direct question when the answer would require them to adjust their position. She'll settle, he said, once she gets used to how things work here. I wrote in the margin of my ledger that night, he is waiting for her to get smaller. She is not going to get smaller. By the end of the first month, she'd planted the seed crate. It turned out to contain tomato seedlings, a variety I didn't recognize, with a dark, almost burgundy stem. She'd started them on the east windowsill of the parlor, which Edmund had noted with restrained irritation, blocked some of the morning light he liked for reading. She'd moved a chair. She had not moved the seedlings. She'd also gotten into a quiet war with the kitchen garden I could see from my east ridge when I rode out in the mornings. It wasn't my garden, Edmund's property, but it had clearly been neglected since Margaret died, and Nora had taken it apart with a systematic thoroughness that reminded me of a surgeon. Out came the old overgrown sage that had gone woody and bitter. In went new beds, laid in neat rows with a precision that suggested she'd mapped it on paper first. She probably had. I started finding excuses to pass the Hale property more often. Not for any sentimental reason. I want to be clear about that, because my ledger is honest even when I am not. But because I was fascinated in the way you're fascinated by something that's moving faster than the things around it. Like watching a river in flood while standing on dry ground. You know you're not in it, but you can't look away. She noticed me noticing around the 6th week. She was staking tomato plants on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was doing the most transparent possible version of checking my own east fence. And she straightened up and looked at me across the property line with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was extremely clear-eyed. You keep a ledger, she said. It wasn't a question. How'd you know that? Edmund mentioned it, said you're the most organized man in the county and the most useless because you record everything and change nothing. She went back to the staking. I thought that was an interesting thing for him to say about a neighbor. I sat with that for a moment. He's not wrong. Probably not, she said, but recording is how you know when something's changed. You can't see change without the record. She pushed a stake into the ground with a clean, decisive motion. What do you record? I told her. Rainfall, frost, cattle figures, fence conditions, the crocus dates. She listened with the kind of attention that people who are used to processing practical information give, a head slightly tilted, actually filing it away, not waiting for a pause to talk. Do you record the soil temperatures? She asked. No. You should, especially this close to the creek drainage. The temperature differential between your east quarter and your west is probably 4 degrees minimum. Changes everything you can grow. I looked at her. I'm a cattle rancher. I know, she said, but you've got Agnes's garden and you're keeping it alive for reasons that aren't practical, so you might as well keep it properly. She said Agnes's name without hesitation, without the sideways quality that people in town usually gave it, the gentle, careful handling of a dead woman's memory. She said it plainly, like a fact in a ledger. It startled me enough that I didn't answer. I went home and started recording soil temperatures. The real trouble started in early June, 6 weeks after her arrival. Nora had, by that point, transformed Edmund's kitchen garden into something resembling a serious operation. 3 times the beds, a cold frame she'd built herself from salvaged window glass and rough timber, and the dark-stemmed tomatoes from her seed crate now 3 feet tall and flowering. She'd also planted 2 varieties of bean along the south fence, a cutting of what she called brandywine from seeds she'd brought in a small paper envelope, and an herb bed that she'd laid out with a nearly architectural precision. Edmund had said nothing about any of it, which I had initially read as tolerance. I revised that reading when I ran into him at the feed store, and he told me, with the careful casualness of a man building toward something, that he'd explained to Nora that the kitchen garden was for household use, and that any expansion into the south quarter would need his approval and was unlikely to be granted. She's a gardener, I said. That's not a flaw. It's a distraction, he said. She's got a house to run. I thought about pointing out that the house was, by all reports, running fine. The meals were good, the laundry done. The accounts Edmund had asked her to manage were in better order than they'd been in years. which his own hired man Dooley had mentioned to me with a kind of awed bewilderment. But I knew the shape of what Edmund was actually saying, and pointing out that Nora was accomplishing everything he'd asked wouldn't address it. What he'd actually asked for was a woman who would be finished when she'd done what he'd asked. Nora was the kind of person who was never finished. There was always the next quarter, the next season, the next problem that needed a practical solution. It was, I suspected, the thing about her that was going to be either the making or the breaking of whatever they were building together. I wrote in the margin that night, he keeps asking her to be smaller. She keeps solving bigger problems. One of them is going to have to give. I didn't know yet which one it would be. I didn't know yet that the answer was neither, that the thing between them wasn't going to resolve cleanly, wasn't going to be a victory or a surrender, but something stranger and more human than either. What I did know, riding home in the last blue light of that June evening, was that whatever Nora Voss was building in that kitchen garden, in the parlor with her seed trays, in the careful rows of Edmund Hale's neglected south quarter, it was not going to stay small. It had the particular quality of things that grow, quiet, persistent, indifferent to the opinion of the people watching. I wrote the soil temperature in my ledger. 61 degrees on the east edge, 56 on the west. She'd been right about the differential. She was right about most things. I was beginning to understand. The question was whether being right would be enough, out here, in a valley that had its own opinions about what women were supposed to build. The crocus in Agnes's garden had come up 14 days early that year. I'd written it down without knowing what it meant. Now, with the particular hindsight of a man who keeps records precisely because he knows he'll need them later, I think it was the first sign that the season was going to be something other than ordinary. I just hadn't learned yet to read Nora Voss the way I read the land. The argument happened on a Thursday. I know this because I wrote it down, not the words, because I wasn't there for the words, but the aftermath, which I witnessed from the uncomfortable position of a man who has come over to borrow a post-hole digger and arrived at entirely the wrong moment. Edmund was standing on the porch with the particular rigid stillness of a man who has just said something he considers final. Nora was in the kitchen garden below, not looking at him, turning the soil in the new bean bed with a spade, and a rhythm that was too deliberate to be casual. The kind of rhythm you develop when you need your hands to do something while your mind processes information your body isn't ready to hold yet. I stopped my horse at the gate and assessed the situation with the speed of a man who has made a career of not walking into things head first. Then I turned around and went home without the post-hole digger. I would come back tomorrow. Some things you don't interrupt in progress. Dooley told me the shape of it later, over the fence on Friday morning, with the apologetic indirection of a man who works for one person and respects the other. Edmund had told Nora she wasn't to plant the south quarter. Not this season, not without his explicit agreement on what and how. He'd said it was a matter of practicality. The south quarter was earmarked for winter grazing rotation, and disrupting that rotation would create problems for the herd management. He'd said it calmly, and with the conviction of a man who believes calmness confers authority. Nora had said, "The south quarter hasn't been used for winter rotation in 2 years. Dooley told me. The grass is too far gone, they won't touch it." Edmund had said, "That's not the point." Nora had said, "Then what is?" And that, Dooley told me, was where it had ended, not with an answer, but with Edmund going inside and Nora going to the bean bed, and the particular silence that settles between two people when the real question has been asked, and nobody is ready to answer it yet. I sat with that for a while, then I wrote in my ledger, "The south quarter is not about the south quarter." The thing is, Edmund wasn't wrong about everything. He wasn't a villain, which would have made this easier to write and simpler to understand. He was a man built by a particular life in a particular place, and that life had taught him a specific set of things about how order was maintained, how a household ran, what a wife was for. Those weren't cruel lessons. They were just incomplete ones. The problem with incomplete lessons is that you can live inside them for years without ever discovering the gaps, until someone arrives who doesn't fit the shape you've built. Nora didn't fight him directly after that Thursday. That's important to record, because it would be easy to tell this as a story about a woman who refused to be contained and a man who failed to contain her, and that framing would be both true and wrong. What actually happened was stranger and sadder, and more human than that. She stopped asking about the south quarter. She did not stop thinking about it. I could tell this from the way she looked at it, that particular focused blankness people get when they're doing math in their heads. But she directed her energy elsewhere with a discipline that I recognized as the discipline of someone who has decided to win something without appearing to fight. She started selling. It happened incrementally, the way all the significant things seemed to happen with Nora. First, it was excess tomatoes from the kitchen garden. She had a surplus by mid-July, the dark-stemmed variety producing more than a household could eat, and she brought them to Mrs. Albrecht at the general store with a handwritten note describing the variety and its characteristics. Mrs. Albrecht sold them in 3 days, brought the money back to Nora and asked for more. Then the beans. Then the herb bundles tied with kitchen twine, labeled in Nora's small, precise hand, placed on a corner of the general store's front counter with a modesty that was, I now suspect, entirely strategic. She priced them at what she later told me was enough to be taken seriously, not so much as to be resented. Edmund knew. He didn't say anything. I think he was processing it, trying to fit it into a category, and the processing took longer than the thing itself. I started talking to Nora more regularly that summer, in the way that neighbors do when a fence line is shared, and both people are often on it for ostensibly separate reasons. She would be staking or harvesting or doing the precise, focused work of someone who is building something on a small scale with the intention of scaling it. And I would be checking my east fence with the dedication of a man whose east fence did not actually require this much attention. She was not warm, exactly. Not cold either. Nothing in her manner was dismissive or unfriendly, but she had a particular quality of attention that meant she was never really idle. Even in conversation, she was listening and cataloging. She'd ask me about my soil temperatures, note the numbers without writing them down, and I would realize later she'd retained them precisely and incorporated them into some larger map she was building in her head of this entire valley's agricultural potential. One morning in August, I told her about Agnes's garden, properly, not just the fact of its existence. Told her about the year Agnes had spent getting the soil right, the specific combination of coffee grounds and rotted oak leaves she'd worked in over 2 winters, the way the carrots in that bed grew twice the size of any carrot I'd seen before or since. Nora listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you still use the coffee grounds?" "No," I said. I didn't know that's what she was doing. I just kept the garden going the way it was. Nora looked at the garden for a moment. "The soil's probably still good," she said. "She built something that's maintaining itself on what she put in, but it'll start declining without the inputs." She paused. "Do you want me to show you how she did it?" I said yes before I thought about it. Then I thought about it and said yes again. She came over 4 times that August, each time with a practical, stated purpose. The coffee grounds, the composting arrangement she helped me set up, the specific way she reorganized the bed layout to account for the light differential I hadn't noticed. Each time she worked with the focused efficiency of a woman who doesn't waste motion. Each time, when the work was done, she looked at the garden the way I imagined she always looked at a thing she'd improved. Not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the professional acknowledgement of someone who sees progress toward a plan. The 4th time, when the work was done and I'd made coffee and we were sitting on the porch steps because the kitchen was hot, she said, almost to herself, "She knew what she was doing, your Agnes." "Yes," I said. "Edmund told me she was quiet," Nora said. "He mentioned her once, said she kept to the house. I think he meant it as a compliment." I didn't answer that. It wasn't that Agnes had been quiet. It was that she'd chosen her battles with a precision I'd only understood after she was gone. The garden had been one of them. She'd built something in that soil over years without ever framing it as an argument, and I had tended it after her without quite understanding that I was tending an argument she'd already won. Nora knew that. I could tell from the way she said it, not pointing at anything, just placing the observation on the step between us like a tool she thought I might need later. The farm stand happened in September. It was not planned, in the sense of being announced or constructed or officially established. It was more that Nora had a surplus of late-season produce. The tomatoes, still going strong, the last of the beans, the herb bundles, and a new addition. 3 varieties of dried pepper she'd strung and dried along the south wall of the kitchen through August. She had too much for the general store's corner. She needed a larger surface. She asked Edmund for the use of 2 sawhorses and some planking from the outbuilding. He said yes. I don't think he understood yet what he was saying yes to. She set up at the north edge of the property, where the road from town passed the Hale Gate. She did it on a Saturday, which was when people came through from Redstone to the mill and back. She arranged the produce with a simplicity that was almost jarring, no performance to it, no decoration, just the things themselves laid out in the order she'd grown them, priced on a small chalkboard in the corner, a tin cup for payment and change. By noon, the plank table was half empty. By the following Saturday, word had spread to the settlement at Cutter Creek, 6 miles east, and there were people Nora had never met standing at that plank table choosing between 2 varieties of late tomato with the seriousness that people bring to decisions about good food. Edmund came out and stood at the gate and watched this happening on his property and said nothing. I was there because I'd brought over a crate of the Brandywine tomatoes she'd given me cuttings for. They'd grown in Agnes's bed with a vigor that had astonished me, and she'd asked if she could sell them on the stand, splitting the proceeds. I'd said yes without thinking, then spent 2 days turning the decision over in my ledger margins, writing and crossing out different interpretations of what I'd agreed to. Standing beside Nora at that plank table, watching Edmund watch us from the gate, I felt the specific discomfort of a man who has become part of something without fully choosing it. But I didn't leave. That, too, is something a ledger records honestly. The moments when you stay not because you decided to, but because leaving would have required a decision you weren't willing to make. Edmund came to my place on Sunday evening. He sat in the same chair, held the same coffee cup, and had the same posture he'd had in June, a man carrying something toward a table. But the thing he was carrying this time was different. It wasn't irritation. It was something more complicated than that, with edges I couldn't quite see. "She made $11 yesterday," he said. "I know," I said. "She told me." He turned the cup. "That's more than I'd have gotten off that quarter running summer grazing." I waited. "She knows that," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact from a man who is beginning to revise a position without wanting to admit that's what he's doing. "She's known it since she got here." "Probably," I said. "Why didn't she just say so?" I thought about Nora at the bean bed after the Thursday argument, about the deliberate rhythm of her spade, about the way she'd asked about Agnes precise, almost clinical, and then set the observation down between us without explanation. About every person I'd ever known who was very good at something and had spent their life having to demonstrate it instead of simply being believed. "She did," I said. "In June." Edmund didn't answer that. He finished the coffee and stood and thanked me and went home, and I sat on my porch in the cooling dark of an early September evening and wrote in my ledger. He is starting to see it. Seeing it is going to cost him more than the South Quarter. I was right. It always costs more than the thing itself. That's the thing about incomplete lessons. The moment you recognize the gap, you also have to reckon with everything you built inside it. The South Quarter question was still unresolved. Nora hadn't pushed. She was still working within the bounds she'd been given, building something real in the space available, which is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. But the season was turning. Frost would come. The stand would close for winter. And in the spring, someone was going to have to decide what the South Quarter was for. The winter of 1887 came in hard and stayed harder. By December, the ground was locked under 8 inches of ice crust, and the temperature at my north gauge dropped to 12 below on 6 consecutive nights, which was the kind of cold that makes the whole enterprise of living out here feel like a thing a reasonable person would reconsider. I kept my ledger by the stove and wrote in it every morning, partly for the record and partly because writing is one of the few things that makes sense when everything outside the window is the same flat white. I recorded temperatures. I recorded the feed levels in the barn, the condition of the cattle, the frost depth in Agnes's garden, 4 inches by the end of January, which was deeper than the year before and which I noted without knowing what it meant for the spring planting. What I mostly wrote about in the margins was the situation at the Hale property. Not because I was prying, I want the record to be clear on that, but because I was watching something happen that I didn't have a name for yet, and the only way I've ever found to understand something I can't name is to describe it in as much detail as possible until the name emerges. Edmund and Nora had reached a kind of winter truce. Not a warm one. There was still the particular careful distance of 2 people who have said difficult true things to each other and are living in the aftermath, but a functional one. The house was running. Edmund had, without announcement or apology, purchased 2 additional cold frames after the stand closed for the season, which he'd told Dooley were for the wife's spring planting. Dooley had told me this with the expression of a man who recognizes a significant event and doesn't quite know how to file it. Nora spent the winter doing something I hadn't expected, writing letters. She'd mentioned it once when I came over to return a borrowed tool in early January, and she was at the kitchen table with 4 sheets of paper in front of her, each covered in that small, precise hand, each addressed to a different place. Seed catalogs, she said, but also nurseries. She was corresponding with a nursery in Pennsylvania about a specific variety of winter squash she'd read about that had a longer storage life than the common types available locally. She was corresponding with a woman in Illinois who ran a market garden and had written an article in an agricultural journal about direct-to-consumer sales that Nora had found in the Redstone Library's 1-year-old periodical stack. She was, I realized, conducting research. The stand had been a test. The winter was her time to think. "Do you have a plan?" I asked, meaning it as a general question and immediately understanding from her expression that I'd stumbled into the middle of something specific. "Yes," she said. "For the South Quarter." She looked at the letters. "For more than the South Quarter." She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. That was one of the things I'd learned about Nora Voss over the course of that strange first year. She told you what she was ready to tell you, and pressing produced a polite, exact wall. You got more by waiting. The conversation that changed everything happened in February, on one of those hard, bright winter days when the snow has a crust, and the sky is the particular shade of blue that only happens when it's 10 degrees and no wind. Edmund came to my door at 3 in the afternoon, which was unusual enough that I knew before he opened his mouth that this wasn't a fence-line conversation. He sat down. He did not reach for the coffee. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want an honest answer." I said I'd try. "Do you think she knows what she's doing?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was, underneath the way he'd phrased it, which still had the slight defensive quality of a man who hasn't fully let go of a position, a real question. Not rhetorical. He was genuinely asking. "Yes," I said. "I think she knows exactly what she's doing and has known since before she got off the stage." Edmund was quiet for a long time. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, somewhere, one of my cattle made a noise that meant nothing specific, but filled the silence in a useful way. "She wants to expand in the spring," he said. "She showed me the numbers last night." "What did the numbers say?" "That the South Quarter, properly planted, would bring in enough by the second season to cover the cost of 2 new hired hands for the main operation. That the stand, expanded, could serve the Cutter Creek settlement and the Dalton Road farms if we built proper access from the road." He said we without seeming to notice it. "That the winter squash variety she's been corresponding about stores 4 months longer than what's available locally, and could be sold into the winter months instead of closing the stand in October." I looked at him. "What did you say?" I said I'd think about it. "And then?" He looked at the floor. "And then I thought about it, and I came over here because you've been watching this longer than I have and writing it down, and I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought if I asked you, the answer might be simpler than asking myself." That was the most honest thing Edmund Hale had ever said to me. It cost him something to say it. I could see that in the set of his jaw, the way he wasn't quite meeting my eyes, but he said it, which meant he was capable of something I hadn't been sure he was capable of. "Say yes," I told him. "Say yes and get out of her way and pay attention to what she teaches you." He nodded once, very slightly, like a man confirming a figure in a column. He went home. I wrote in my ledger, "He is going to say yes. This is not a happy ending. It is a beginning which is harder." Spring came with the particular insistence of springs that have been waited for a long time. The frost broke in the second week of March, 2 days earlier than any year I'd recorded since Agnes died, and Nora was in the South Quarter with a soil thermometer and a paper notebook before the thaw was even complete. I watched her from my east ridge, moving methodically across the field, pressing the thermometer into the earth at regular intervals, writing numbers, pressing again. Edmund was with her. That was the thing that stopped me on the ridge, made me take out my actual ledger and record the moment, because it was the kind of thing that sounds small and is not. Edmund Hale walking across his own south quarter with his wife, watching her read the ground, not talking, just watching and occasionally carrying the notebook when her hands were full. He had said yes, not eloquently, not with any of the language of a man who's decided he was wrong. He never said he was wrong, which was its own kind of honesty, because what he was admitting was more complicated than being wrong. He'd said yes the way a practical man says it. He'd asked Nora to write the plan properly, with the costs and the timeline and the projected returns, and when she'd presented it to him at the kitchen table, he'd read it twice and then set it down and said, "The access road will cost more than you've accounted for. I know a man in Cutter Creek who'll build it at cost if I do his winter fence repairs." Nora had looked at him across the table with an expression I wasn't there to see, but which I can reconstruct from everything I knew of her. Not triumph, not softness, but the particular clear look of someone who has found what they were actually looking for, which was not permission but partnership. They broke ground on the south quarter in late March. Nora had planned it in 7 sections, each with its own variety rotation, each accessible from a central path that also served as drainage, something she designed over the winter using principles from the Illinois Gardener's Journal that she explained to me once in detail I could only partially follow. Edmund had hired 2 men from the settlement to help with the initial breaking. He'd also built, without telling Nora about it in advance, a better table for the farm stand, proper lumber, not planking, with a hinged cover for weather, set back 6 feet from the road with a post and a sign. The sign said, "Hale Farm Stand." Nora stood and looked at it for a long moment when she first saw it. I was there helping set the post, and I watched her face cycle through something I couldn't name, not exactly surprise, not exactly gratitude, but something in the neighborhood of both, with a quality of grief underneath it that I didn't fully understand until later. She had been building this alone for the better part of a year. Having her name on it, even subsumed into Hale, was both what she'd worked for and also a reminder of the cost of the working. She said, "Thank you." Edmund said, "It needs a proper sign." She said, "It is a proper sign." And that was that. The stand opened in May. The south quarter came in through June and July, slower than Nora's projections for the first season, which she had accounted for and Edmund had not. And then in August it produced with an abundance that I found myself standing in and staring at with the particular reverence I usually reserved for exceptional acts of nature. The dark-stemmed tomatoes, now spreading across their full intended section, were producing more fruit per plant than I'd seen in 20 years of farming. The winter squash, the Pennsylvania variety, had germinated at a rate Nora described as better than I'd hoped, which from her was effusive praise. The herb section had become a destination in itself, people coming specifically for the bundles, for the dried peppers, for the small jars of herb salt that Nora had added in July without announcing it, which had sold out in 3 days and required a waiting list, which was a sentence I would not have believed I'd write in this ledger a year ago. By the 2nd September, Hale Farm Stand was known as far as Milford Junction, 20 miles north. There were people who came from the junction specifically, which meant a 20-mile round trip for vegetables, which was either absurd or a testament to something. I recorded it as both. Edmund had changed in ways that were hard to quantify and easy to see if you'd been watching as long as I had. He still had the particular bearing of a man who considers himself the authority in a room, but there was something else in it now, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before, a tendency to listen before speaking in situations where he would previously have simply spoken. He had started keeping a ledger. He hadn't told me this. I'd seen it on his kitchen table when I came to borrow the post-hole digger I'd been trying to borrow since June. A small brown book, numbers in columns, a few margin notes in a hand that was rougher than Nora's but trying, I thought, for the same thing. I didn't say anything about it, some things you don't interrupt. I'm writing this in October of 1888, a year and a half after Nora Voss stepped off the Redstone stage with a seed crate and a pair of clean, soil-darkened hands. The stand has closed for winter. The south quarter is under its first season of cover crop, a technique Nora introduced that Edmund had initially questioned, and then, having seen the reasoning, endorsed with the thoroughness of a man who adopts a position completely once he's adopted it at all. Agnes's garden produced better this year than any year since she died. I recorded the carrot size, 11 inches, some of them, and the specific color of the late beets, which was a deep, almost black red that she would have appreciated. I am using the coffee grounds, I am tracking the soil temperatures. I am not sure what Agnes would have made of Nora Voss, or Nora of Agnes, but I think they might have had a great deal to say to each other about soil and patience, and the particular arithmetic of building things in places that don't necessarily want to be built in. Nora came over last week to look at the garden. She does this periodically with no announcement and no stated reason. She simply appears at the east fence and asks if I mind, and I never mind, and she walks the beds with that assessing look and sometimes says things and sometimes doesn't. This time she stopped at the carrot bed and crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil in the particular testing way she has, and was quiet for a long time. Then she said she was good. Yes, I said. You kept what she built. I didn't answer. She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at the garden in that way she has, assessing, acknowledging, moving on. Then she walked back to the fence and said she'd see me at the spring planning meeting, because she and Edmund were thinking about expanding the squash section and wanted my soil temperature data from the East Ridge for comparison. I said I'd have it ready. She nodded and went home, across the field that was not quite hers and not quite not, toward the house where the parlor she'd been sent to manage had become the planning room of something that nobody in Redstone had predicted, and that was still, in every sense that mattered, only partway done. I wrote in my ledger that night. The numbers first: carrot yield, beet count, soil temperature at the East Ridge, 58 degrees and holding. Then in the margin in the smaller hand I keep for the things that don't fit in columns. She didn't build it for him or despite him or to prove something. She built it because she knew what the ground could hold and she wasn't willing to let it hold less.